The morning they called me up to the executive floor, I was sure I was being fired. I'd been a nurse at Caldwell Regional for 6 years, and in all that time I had never once set foot above the 4th floor. The top floor was a different country up there. Carpet instead of linoleum, real plants, a receptionist who looked at my scrubs like I'd tracked something in. I sat in a leather chair for 20 minutes with my hands folded in my lap, running through everything I might have done wrong, and when the heavy door finally opened and a woman waved me in, I stood up so fast my knees cracked. There was a long table in there, the kind that costs more than my car. Our CEO was standing at the far end, and he never stood for anyone. Beside him was a man in a charcoal suit, silver hair combed back neat, hands resting flat on the table, and the second I saw his face, my stomach dropped straight through the floor because I knew him. I'd just never known his name. He looked at me with those same steady eyes, the ones I remembered from a Tuesday 2 weeks earlier, and he said, "There she is," like he'd been waiting, like I was someone worth waiting for. To understand why a man like that was sitting at the head of that table, you have to go back to that Tuesday, to the worst part of a 12-hour shift in a basement cafeteria nobody important ever sees. I work nights. Most people hear that and wince, but I'd take a night shift over a day shift every time. The hospital gets quiet after 11. The hallways dim down to half their lights, the visitors clear out, and what's left is just you and your patients and the people who keep the place alive after dark. The housekeeping crew, the security guards, the cafeteria lady, who's been ringing up the same sleepy nurses for 30 years. There's a kind of family that only exists at 2 in the morning. You don't see them in daylight, but they're the ones who get you through. That Tuesday had been brutal. We were short 2 nurses, the floor was full, and I'd had a patient coding right at the start of my shift. By the time I got my 30-minute break, it was almost 3 in the morning, and I was running on fumes and bad coffee. I took the elevator down to the basement cafeteria, which at that hour is barely a cafeteria at all. Half the lights off, the hot line shut down, just a cooler of sandwiches and a coffee machine and Pearl behind the register doing a crossword. There was one other person down there, an old man sitting alone at a table near the wall. I noticed him because he didn't look like he belonged in a hospital at 3 in the morning. He wasn't in a robe or a gown, wasn't pushing an IV pole, didn't have the worn-down look of somebody who'd been sitting in a waiting room for hours. He had on a flannel shirt buttoned all the way to the top and a windbreaker that had seen a lot of winters, and he was just sitting there with a tray in front of him. A turkey sandwich, a cup of soup, a coffee, eating slow, the way you eat when you've got nowhere to be and nobody waiting up for you. I got my coffee and a sad little package of crackers, and I was halfway to a table of my own when I heard it. "I'm sorry, sir," its saying declined. Pearl wasn't loud about it. She's not a cruel woman. But the cafeteria was dead silent at that hour, and the words carried. The old man was standing at the register. He'd gone up to pay, and his card hadn't worked. He tried it again. I watched him slide it through, careful with both hands. And Pearl shook her head and said, "Soft, still no. You got another one?" And I watched this man's face do something I'll never forget. He didn't get angry. He didn't argue. He just sort of folded inward. His shoulders came down. He set the card on the counter and started patting his jacket pockets slow, the way you do when you already know there's nothing in them. He said. "Let me just." He pulled out a worn leather billfold and opened it, and there were a couple of singles in there. He counted them with his thumb. The sandwich and the soup and the coffee came to $14.85. He had $4. I have seen a lot of hard things in this job. I've held hands while machines went quiet. But there is something about watching a grown man, a man old enough to be my grandfather, stand at a register and slowly understand that he can't pay for a turkey sandwich, that absolutely wrecked me. He started to say something to Pearl about putting the food back, about it being fine, he wasn't that hungry anyway. And his voice was doing this thing where it stayed perfectly level on purpose, which is somehow so much worse than crying. I didn't even really decide to do it. I just walked up, set my own coffee on the counter and said, "Pearl, put his on mine and ring me up another coffee while you're at it. This one's gone cold." The old man turned and looked at me. "Oh no," he said. "No, miss, you don't need to do that. I've got a card. It's just the bank's hold on it. There was some fraud thing. They froze it. I just need to call them in the morning and I believe you, I said, and I did. But the morning's a long way off and your soup's getting cold. Let me get this one. You can get mine next time. He went quiet. He looked at me for a second longer than was comfortable, and I had the strangest feeling he was reading me, like there was a lot more going on behind those eyes than a hungry old man. Then he just nodded, once, and said, "Next time, I'll hold you to that." Pearl rang it up, $22 and change. I left a couple bucks in the tip jar out of habit, and I picked up my fresh coffee. And here's the part I'm not proud of, except that I think it was the right thing. I didn't sit with him. I didn't make it a moment. I've been on the other side of charity when I was a kid and money was thin, and I know that the worst thing you can do for somebody's pride is stand there and watch them be grateful. So I just said, "Enjoy your sandwich, sir," and I went back upstairs to finish my shift. He called after me when I was almost to the elevator. "What's your name?" "Hazel," I said. "Hazel," he repeated like he was filing it somewhere. "Thank you." And that was it. The elevator doors closed. I genuinely thought I would never see that man again. I figured he was somebody's father or grandfather who'd come in to sit with family and gotten stuck overnight, the way people do, and that he'd go home in the morning once the sun came up and his bank straightened itself out. I thought about him on the drive home, and then I more or less forgot about it. The way you forget most of the small things you do, because there's always another shift, another full floor, another patient coding right when you walk in. 2 weeks went by. In those 2 weeks, the other part of this story was getting worse, and I should tell you about that, because it's the part that had me convinced I was about to lose my job. We'd gotten a new nurse manager that spring. I won't pretend I was fair to her at first. Change is hard on a floor that runs as tight as ours, but it didn't take long for everybody to see she had a particular way about her. She was the kind of manager who needed problems to exist so she could be the one solving them. If the floor was running smooth, she got restless, and for some reason she decided early on that I was a problem. It started small, a comment in a meeting about how I documented too slowly, a note about my break running 4 minutes long. Nothing you could point at and call unfair, exactly, but enough of it day after day that you start to feel watched. Then it got more pointed. A medication was logged late one night, not by me, but it happened on my shift, and she wrote it up with my name attached. When I tried to explain, she cut me off and said the floor needed accountability, and that some of the senior nurses had gotten comfortable. I knew what was happening, even if I couldn't prove it. There'd been talk of cuts. The hospital had been bought out by some bigger health system the year before, and everybody knew positions were going to get trimmed. And the easiest position to cut is the one with a paper trail of write-ups attached to it. She was building a case. She was making me the comfortable senior nurse who needed to go, so that when the numbers came down from above, she had a name to hand them. Mine. The day before they called me upstairs, she'd written me up a third time for insubordination, because I'd questioned, in front of 2 other nurses, whether moving a fall-risk patient to a room farther from the station was safe. It was a clinical question, a patient safety question. I was right to ask it. But she made it about respect, about chain of command, about my attitude, and she told me to expect a formal review. So when the executive office called my cell the next morning, before I'd even gotten to sleep, and said the COO wanted to see me upstairs at 10, I did not think promotion. I cried in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes first. Then I fixed my face and went up, because that's what you do. Which is how I ended up standing in that conference room, looking at the old man from the cafeteria sitting at the head of the table in a suit that cost more than I make in a month. For a second, nobody said anything. The CEO looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. There was the COO, a woman from HR with a folder, and my nurse manager. She was there too, sitting stiff in a chair against the wall, and when our eyes met, she gave me this thin little smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. She thought she'd won. She thought this was the firing. The old man spoke first. "Hazel," he said, "sit down, please." I sat. I don't think my legs would have held me much longer anyway. "You don't know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. There's no reason you would. My name is Calvin Albright. I didn't recognize it, not right away. But I watched my nurse manager's face go a particular shade of gray, and the CEO shifted his weight, and the COO suddenly got very interested in the table, and I realized that everybody in that room except me knew exactly who Calvin Albright was. He saw me not recognizing it, and he almost smiled. My father opened the first clinic that became this hospital in 1961, he said. 2 exam rooms and a waiting area over on the east side. I ran the company that grew out of it for 31 years. I sit on the board of the system that owns this place now. They put my name on the cancer wing, which I told them not to do, but nobody listens to an old man's. He folded. I come back through every so often unannounced. I don't tell anybody. I put on an old jacket and I sit in the waiting rooms and the cafeteria and I watch how my people treat the people who walk through these doors. You learn more in one night down in that basement at 3 in the morning than you do in a year of reports. It was starting to land on me, slow like cold water soaking through a coat. The card, I said. It was all I could think to say. Your card really was frozen. My bank's fraud department doing their job a little too well. He waved a hand. I could have called my assistant. I could have flashed a black card and had Pearl falling over herself. But I wanted to see what would happen to an old man with $4 and a sandwich at 3 in the morning on the worst night of a hard shift when nobody important was watching. His voice got quieter. And you know what happened, Hazel? Nothing. Almost nothing. The whole room kept its head down. Tired people doing a hard job, and I don't blame a single one of them. I felt my throat close. You didn't make a show of it, he said. You didn't want my gratitude. You didn't even sit down. You believed me about the card when you had no reason to, and you protected an old stranger's dignity like it was the most natural thing in the world, and then you went back to work. I sat down there and finished that sandwich, and I'll be honest with you, I had to take a minute. He cleared his throat. $22. You spent when a son you thought you'd never see again on a night you had every reason to keep your head down like everybody else. It wasn't anything, I said. My voice came out small. Anybody would have. No, he said, and there was steel in it now, gentle but unmistakable. They wouldn't have. That's the whole point. That's the entire point of why I do this. He looked around the table. I had my office pull the records from that night. Took a while to find you. You weren't on the cafeteria camera long, but I found out who you were, and then I made the mistake of asking your personnel file. The room got very still. 3 write-ups in 2 weeks, he said. He opened a slim folder in front of him and laid his hand flat on it without looking down. Documentation pace. A late med log that, when I had it actually investigated, was logged by a different nurse entirely and in subordination for asking whether it was safe to move a fall-risk patient away from the nurse's station. He finally looked up and he looked at my manager. Was she right? About the patient? My manager opened her mouth, closed it. It was a judgment call. Was she right? He said again, not louder, just slower. The CO answered for her very carefully. The patient should not have been moved, sir. Hazel's concern was correct. So she was written up, Calvin Albright said, for being correct about patient safety. In front of 2 witnesses, she was disciplined for protecting a patient. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away too. I've been doing this a long time. I know what a paper trail looks like. I built companies, I had to fire people, sometimes good people, and I know the difference between a problem employee and an inconvenient one. He turned to the CEO. I'd like the next part of this conversation to happen without an audience. Hazel, would you wait outside for a few minutes? Pearl from the cafeteria is up here too. She's been wanting to say hello. There's coffee. Better than what we serve downstairs, I'm told. I want to tell you that I marched out of there with my head high. The truth is, I more or less floated out, numb, and sat in that leather chair again, and a young woman brought me a coffee in a real cup, and I held it with both hands and shook a little. I never found out exactly what was said in that room after I left. I know my nurse manager came out about 15 minutes later, and she did not look at me, and she walked very fast to the elevator. And within the month, she was gone. Not fired in any dramatic way, just quietly moved to another facility, which is how big systems make their problems disappear. I heard later, through the kind of hallway talk that's never quite reliable, that he hadn't yelled at her. That wasn't his way. I heard he'd simply asked her to walk him through each of my write-ups one by one out loud and made her explain the reasoning behind each one to his face, and that somewhere around the second one she'd run out of reasons. Sometimes that's worse than yelling. Sometimes the kindest, most devastating thing a powerful person can do is just quietly ask you to justify yourself and let the silence do the rest. When they called me back in, the folder was closed and pushed to the side. The COO talked for a while about the review being voided, about it never going in my file, about a process for raising patient safety concerns that would actually protect the people who raised them. I caught maybe half of it. I kept looking at the old man. When the official part was done and people started gathering their things, he held up a hand and they all just waited. That's a kind of power I'd never seen up close. He didn't raise his voice or his hand much past his shoulder, and a room full of executives went quiet and waited. "Hazel," he said, "walk an old man to the elevator." So I did. The two of us down that long carpeted hallway slow because his knees weren't what they used to be. He had a cane now, I noticed, that he hadn't had in the cafeteria. He'd left it in the car that night, he told me, because a man with a cane gets pity, and pity gets you treated different, and he hadn't wanted to be treated different. He'd wanted to be treated like everybody else with $4 and a frozen card. "Can I tell you something," he said, "that I don't tell many people?" "Of course. My wife passed 4 years ago." He said it plainly, the way you say things you've made your peace with. 61 years married. "She's the reason I do these visits. She used to say you can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone who can't do a single thing for them in return. Someone who can't promote them, can't tip them, can't even remember their name the next day. She said that's the only honest test there is." He stopped walking and turned to look at me. Most people pass that test when somebody's watching. You passed it at 3 in the morning with a dead phone battery and nobody around but a cafeteria cashier. That's rare. I've run companies of 50,000 people, and that kind of thing is rare at every single level. The higher up you go, Hazel, and I have been all the way up, the more people are kind for a reason. You did it for no reason at all. That's the only kind worth anything. I didn't know what to say, so I said the true thing. I almost didn't. I almost just took my coffee and sat down. I was so tired. "I know," he said, "that's why it counts." We got to the elevator. He pressed the button himself, waved off the young woman who tried to do it for him, and then he reached into his suit and pulled out his billfold. The same worn leather one, I realized, the one with the singles in it from that night. And he took out 2 crisp dollar bills and a slightly creased one, and he pressed them into my hand and folded my fingers over them. "What's this?" I said. "You said I could get yours next time," he said. "I'm an old man. I keep my word. I'm a little short. Call it a down payment on the next coffee. We'll settle up the rest." The elevator dinged. He stepped in. And right before the doors closed, he looked at me with those steady eyes and said, "Don't let anybody up here make you smaller than you are down there. You hear me? The basement at 3 in the morning is where the real work happens. Don't ever forget that's the floor that matters." The doors closed, and I stood there in that hallway holding $3 in my hand, crying like an idiot in front of the receptionist who'd looked down on my scrubs an hour earlier and who now, I noticed, was looking at me very differently. I still have those $3. I never spent them. They're tucked in the corner of my bathroom mirror at home, where I see them every morning before a shift. Calvin Albright passed away the following winter. I read it in the paper before anybody at the hospital said a word. There was a big obituary, a whole half-page, talking about the company he'd built, and the wing with his name on it, and the foundations he'd funded, and the thousands of jobs he'd created. It was a good obituary. It had everything in it except the only thing I really knew about him, which was that he was a man who would sit alone in a basement at 3 in the morning with $4 and a turkey sandwich, just to find out whether anyone in the building he owned would treat a stranger like a human being. I went to the visitation. I almost didn't. I figured it'd be all suits and important people, and I'd feel like I had no business there. But I went, in the nicest thing I own, and I stood in a long line, and when I finally got to the front, there was a woman about my age receiving people, his granddaughter, and when I said my name, something flickered across her face. Hazel, she said, the nurse. She took both my hands. He told that story so many times, the cafeteria, the $4. She laughed a little, the wet kind. He told it at Thanksgiving. He told it to people who'd never set foot in that hospital. I think it was his favorite thing that happened to him in the last 10 years, and you have to understand, a lot of things happened to my grandfather. She squeezed my hands. He said you didn't even sit down. He said that was how he knew. I drive past that hospital basement entrance every night I work, and I think about the family that only exists at 2 in the morning. The housekeepers and the guards and Pearl with her crossword, the people nobody important ever sees. And I think about an old man in a borrowed-looking windbreaker who turned out to own the building, and how he wasn't testing whether we were good at our jobs. He was testing something a lot simpler and a lot harder than that. I'm a nurse manager myself now. They offered it to me a year after that morning, and I almost turned it down because I'd seen what the title could do to a person. The first thing I did was take down the policy that lets you write somebody up for asking whether something's safe. I tell my new nurses one thing on their first night, and I tell them it's the only rule that really matters. Somewhere out there, every single shift, is a person who can't do a single thing for you in return. Can't promote you, can't thank you in any way that counts, won't remember your name in the morning. How you treat that person when you're tired and nobody's watching. That's not part of the job, that's the whole job.